Welcome back to ReInvent Healthcare, the podcast for health and wellness practitioners who are passionate about making a difference. Today, we're going to be talking about the thyroid, and we're going to talk about one of the most, if not the most common causes of diagnosed hypothyroidism. And we are going to talk about how the thyroid and thyroid imbalances are connected to adrenal imbalance. And I am so excited today to have here as my guest, Dr. Izabella Wentz. She's a doctor of pharmacy, over 20 years of experience. She found out the hard way about this commonly undiagnosed condition, the most common cause of hypothyroidism. And she has written books. She's written 3 books on thyroid, and she has done a summit on thyroid, and she's very, very prolific on Facebook, on Instagram. I've even seen her on TikTok talking about this condition and helping millions of people around the world to overcome this problem. Her first book became a New York Times bestseller, and we'll have links to all of her books and all of her resources on the show notes page. So if you're ready to hear from us, we have Dr. Izabella Wentz, and I just can't wait to dive into this with you, Izabella.
Oh, Dr. Rita Marie, it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for saying that. But I remember back when I met you, what was it, like 10 years ago or something like that? And you'd written your book and you were just starting out to get familiar with this online world. And I invited you to speak on my Now, I didn't have a podcast back then. It was a radio show on Blog Talk Radio. And you said, oh my goodness, that's the first public interview. So I'm so thrilled to have you back here, 10 years later, massive success, and everybody knows who you are. So thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule with your wonderful husband, Michael, and your son, what is he, about 1.5 years, 2 years old, Dimitri?
He's almost 5.
What? No.
He's going to be 5 in 3 months. And that's why I'm sort of back doing interviews, because I've been in mommy mode the last few years.
But, time goes by so fast. Oh, Lord. I had no idea he was that old. Okay. Pretty soon he'll be 25 like my kids. Oh, my gosh. That's crazy. My youngest is almost 25. And my oldest is almost 29. Yeah. Crazy. They were little kids when we first met, right? I was telling you how much work it is to have little kids and do a business at the same time. And you found it out.
I found it out. Yes, I did. It is so sweet though. He's at such a perfect little age right now. He's just so lovely. And Mommy, I love you. Let's do this together. He likes to wear matching clothes with me. I take him grocery shopping and he takes out everything out of the shopping cart and puts it on the belt. He's just like little person. I'm like, can you just stay exactly like?
No, they don't. So enjoy it, from 5 to 10. Well, 10 they start to get a little crazy, but 5 to 8 maybe. I really enjoy them.
It's the sweet spot, huh?
It's kind of the sweet spot, and then they're different, and then they go through this crazy middle stage, and then they get to be in their 20s, and they're like real human beings, and you can have real human being conversations. So there's a lot there. But let's talk about this condition. So what is it? I know people probably know this already because they're health and wellness practitioners, but what is this most common cause of hypothyroidism? And tell us a little bit about how you became such an expert in it and why you got so passionate about sharing this adventure with the world.
So Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition that impacts the thyroid glands. And I know people always say oh, it sounds so rare and exotic, right? But it's not. It's very, very common. I would say, depending on which research study you look at, anywhere from 90% to 97, maybe even some will say 99% of cases of hypothyroidism in the Western world are going to be due to Hashimoto's. And most people are not aware that they have Hashimoto's. They're told that they have a sluggish thyroid, that they have hypothyroidism or an underactive thyroid, and their thyroid's not lazy. It is under attack by the immune system, and a lot of times it is damaged so that it cannot produce enough thyroid hormone. And so Hashimoto's is actually the initial stage of you can have Hashimoto's, but not hypothyroidism for maybe as long as 10 years. but your thyroid gland will be under this immune attack and you're going to have symptoms associated with it. A lot of times anxiety may occur, just general feelings of unwell. But if doctors don't run the right labs, they will say that a person's thyroid function is normal. And so that's why I'm so passionate about it, because for almost a decade, I was like going to the doctor. I was in pharmacy school. I was even a practicing pharmacist when I was like, something's not right with me. I'm in my 20s, but I'm sleeping for 12 hours a night and feeling exhausted. I'm losing my hair. I have carpal tunnel in both arms. I have all these allergies. I had this mystery cough that just started out of nowhere. Like just all of these like really annoying symptoms. And it was like, okay, you're not dying, right? But it's really interfering with having any kind of life, right?
Yeah, right. And those are not the typical symptoms that someone approaches a doctor with, thinking that they have thyroid issues, right? Typically, somebody goes in and they have constipation, depression, they're gaining weight, they're cold, right? But the other symptoms that you described, which are almost like the precursor to the hypothyroid symptoms, and they are overlooked, and they're overlooked because conventional medicine is not taught to measure antibodies. And I want to just go back one moment to what you said earlier, and I want everybody to really sit with this, that the antibodies can be present and attacking the thyroid a good 10 years before the real symptoms start to come. So as practitioners, we need to include thyroid antibodies in everybody's baseline testing. Every single person that comes to see you, they've got some sort of issues, right? Or they wouldn't be coming in and seeing you. And we have to include those antibodies for everybody, not just women of childbearing age, not just, people with the symptoms, but everybody should have those. And I just want to mention the sex variation there. It's more common in women, but I'm sure you've seen lots of men with Hashimoto's.
Definitely. It's anywhere out there from 3 to 7 women will get diagnosed for one man with the condition. But let's not forget about men. And what's interesting in men, typically women will complain about gaining weight, or they might have fatigue or anxiety. Men will complain about libido, which is interesting, and it makes sense because when we don't have enough thyroid hormone on board, that can actually cause alterations in testosterone levels for men. And they will complain about not having their muscles just kind of going away. And they're saying like, okay, I'm still going to the gym, but I'm just not as muscular. And I'm not seeing men typically complain about like, I'm gaining weight. They're typically coming with fatigue, they're coming with libido issues, and they're coming with saying like something's up with my muscles, right? And I'm just not as muscular as I used to be. And some men will also and women will present with mood related issues, and sometimes the mood related issues might be the only thing when you're like, I'm so anxious or I feel very moody. I've always been like this very even keeled person, and I'm very even keeled now. If most people are like, how are you so calm all the time? I'm like, that's just my personality, right? Like, that's just who I am. Not when I had undiagnosed Hashimoto's. I had panic attacks. I would be like, my husband would go jogging and I would be like in the bathroom crying, thinking something happened to him because it was 20 minutes that had passed. And I would just be super anxious across the board, from social anxiety to just anxiety about everything. And so many people struggle with that, and they're told, oh, just get a prescription for an antidepressant or an anxiety medication. And it's like, no, actually, it's your thyroid. Or women will have multiple miscarriages, and they're just, this is why I'm so passionate about it, because for decades, people are told that it's in their head, that they're crazy, that they need a psychiatric referral, and a term that has come to light in these modern days is gaslighting, medical gaslighting. And that's what happens to a lot of these people. And they're like, there's nothing wrong with you, you're a hypochondriac. And it's like, no, you have an autoimmune attack on your thyroid gland. Most conventional doctors will not test antibodies unless your thyroid TSH marker is out of balance, which is kind of like backwards because the antibodies come before the TSH gets out of balance. And so I just think it's a little bit nutty. And, how did I become an expert? I became an expert by being a human guinea pig because the conventional medical approach to thyroid issues wasn't working for me.
Yes. But it doesn't work for most people, right? So first of all, most doctors, you said they'll test after there's a TSH high, but most of them don't even do that because the way they're trained in medical school is if the TSH is high, then you test the T4. If the T4 is low, then you give them thyroid medication. You give them T4. Diagnosis ends, assessment ends, evaluation ends. And some people get really good results with that. And some people don't because you're missing like conversion issues, of receptor issues, and autoimmune issues, right? It keeps getting worse because the immune system keeps attacking the thyroid. So what really needs to change is the way that doctors look at people who complain of symptoms of hypothyroidism. But what I really want to get across here, because we've been talking about this on other episodes, we've been talking about the poor people who have all the symptoms, but they have perfect labs, perfect by Western means, and sometimes perfect by our functional levels. And so we've been talking about cellular hypothyroidism and, the uptake and all that. But this is really important for everybody who's listening to just pay attention to. You may have symptoms that are not conventional hypothyroid symptoms because your thyroid's being attacked and there's some weird stuff going on. And so we have to do this, I believe. It's just like insulin. I'm a big fan of. Everybody should have insulin tested. Everybody needs to have thyroid antibodies tested because those are the early markers of problems. Insulin elevated or fasting glucose, which is what's the norm there, that's the late stage indication of insulin resistance and diabetes. The same way that TSH elevation is a late stage manifestation. And we want to be the heroes for people and catch it in the early stages so they don't progress to where Izabella was thinking, I'm in my 20s, what the heck is going on here, right? So I just appreciate what you're doing and all the work you've done out there to educate the public. And a lot of doctors now are more and more talking about this, right?
Yeah, I'm so grateful. Just when I was talking about Hashimoto's, I think there was maybe one other Hashimoto's book on the market and just very few practitioners that were talking about it. And now I see it everywhere. And I'm so grateful for that there's just such a big amount of awareness that is out there for Hashimoto's, and just makes my heart so happy. The other day I was doing my continuing education for pharmacists, and I was, you have to do 30 hours every 2 years, and you get to pick the topics, which is awesome. And so I was going through some of the topics, and I found one on Hashimoto's or in hypothyroidism, and subclinical hypothyroidism, and I started going through it. It was amazing because the person that was presenting it used my books as a reference to create for pharmacists about thyroid disorders. And I'm just like, this is so amazing. I'm so grateful that so much awareness is happening. So this is like, everything that I had hoped for and dreamed for when I was so fed up with modern, conventional medicine. And I was like, why did nobody tell me this was going on? And then once I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, they were like, well, here's a medication. And I was like, thank goodness, a medication. I'm a pharmacist. I was like, this is going to solve less of my problems. And then I was like, no, wait a minute. What's going on? Why do I still feel like crap? And then I was like, why didn't I learn about there's different kind of medications in pharmacies? I only learned about one kind of thyroid medication in pharmacy school, and I learned that the other medications didn't work as well, and they were old school. You shouldn't use them. I didn't learn anything about root causes. I didn't learn about slowing the progression of Hashimoto's in pharmacy school, and so now I'm excited that to get the message out there with you. Still there? Excited that pharmacists are now learning this, and other kinds of practitioners are learning this across the board. So yay for getting the message out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so excited that you have done that and more people are aware of it and they are testing antibodies, which is great. But what is it? So you took the medication. Was it levothyroxine or Synthroid or?
I got various prescriptions, and I ended up taking some compounded thyroid meds, and they helped a little bit, but not like, it wasn't like night and day. Like I went from sleeping 12 hours a night to like 11 hours a night. I went from wearing 2 jackets in Southern California, like, in the summer, to like 1 jacket, right? And a scarf. So it wasn't like, I still had carpal tunnel. I still had my anxiety, panic attacks. My hair was still falling out. I still had like the acid reflux. I still had digestive issues. So definitely medications, part of a treatment plan, they can be helpful, but they they didn't do everything, right? So there was a lot more work that I had to do to actually feel like a human again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So what was that work? I mean, tell us more about not only what you did, but what you found in all the years you've been working with other people on this. What does seem to be the most, like, I like to talk about frameworks, right? I don't like to talk about protocols because everybody's different, but there's a framework for us as practitioners to go through to say, okay, let's look at this, let's look at this, let's look at this. So what are some of those things that are in your let's look at this and that we should make sure that we're looking at?
So in broad categories, I look at food sensitivities, nutrient depletions, impaired ability to handle stress, impaired ability to handle toxins, chronic infections, and gut health. And we can go into detail on any of these, but those are kind of the buckets or categories of things that I will look at, in addition to making sure that thyroid hormones are optimal too. So where, conventional medicine just gives people hormones and they don't look at whether the person's on the right balance, if they're converting correctly, if they're, all of the wonderful things that you teach as well. So, of course, doing that, but also looking at like the whole body as a system and the causes and like what's out of balance, what led this person to have Hashimoto's, right. And also when they were hypothyroid for so long, what systems in their bodies were broken down and what needs to be corrected now, right? Or what's happening when you add thyroid hormone to the mix? How's that going to impact their physiology, right? So I look at all of these different things, and I think it sounds overwhelming, but there's actually you can be very strategic about it, and you can help most people feel better. I would say sometimes in just 2 weeks, sometimes in 4 weeks, sometimes even longer, but there are specific things you can do and patterns that I've been able to identify that for majority of people, we can definitely get them to feel better very, very quickly, even when they've been sick and symptomatic for decades.
Right. And what you're talking about, though, is really what is the framework for someone with an autoimmune disease, right? If they have lupus, if they have MS, if they have Hashimoto's, all of the things you mentioned need to be addressed, or none of that is going to get better. And what we see, and I think the statistic I heard was 60 to 70% of people who have one autoimmune disease, like say you got Hashimoto's diagnosed, that there's the likelihood of a second or third, really high percentage, 60 to 70%.
I didn't even know it was that high. We always know that if you have one autoimmune condition, you have a higher risk of getting another one, but that's huge. And I just will say for everybody listening, I feel like that's people that don't go the functional medicine route, right? These are people that are left to conventional medicine and just giving you a drug for whatever is going on. The immune progression can happen. And part of the work that we do is we're trying to prevent not just to get somebody feel good, but also prevent that autoimmune march maybe or spiral
into them not being able to get off the couch at all. So yeah, I agree with you there, because the conventional approach to any autoimmune disease is to give a drug, right? Just give a drug, give thyroid hormone, give, some sort of drug to, calm the gut. And it's really not calming the gut. It's really just turning off the symptoms in the gut, like with Crohn's and things like that. Or
right?
What's that?
It's basically shutting down the chemical messengers, right? That are letting you know something's out of balance.
Exactly.
drugs too. And I love drugs. I'm a pharmacist, but they have their time and place. But when you've got autoimmune disease, there's all these other things that are going on.
Right. And we have to address it or we lead to others. And maybe we'll have another session on talking about the autoimmunes, but we've had podcasts. If you go back in the ReInvent Healthcare progression, we had a few of them on autoimmune. So you can go back there and look. But here's the thing, right? Somebody comes in, they're diagnosed with Hashimoto's, but they're just left it at that. So I want to look at some of the other systems that are involved. I've talked a lot about the involvement of the blood sugar balancing and how that is so critical to handling the hypothyroid situation. We've talked about in this series already, we talked about it's not just hypothyroid. The thyroid can be perfect, not being attacked, perfectly functioning, but the symptoms of hypothyroid persist. And I believe that's the most under-addressed population because you're like, you're a hypochondriac, or here's your Prozac, or here's your, laxative, because they're going to address the single symptoms. But in this case, I really want to talk with regard to the thyroid. You told me recently that you're almost finished writing a book on adrenal health. And that's going to be coming out in a couple months. And I'm like, why are you doing that? You're the thyroid expert. So share with us the connection and why we need to look at the adrenals in order to heal the thyroid.
Sure, of course. And so I guess in very simple terms, looking through all of the different people that I've worked with thyroid issues, testing their adrenals, more than 90% of them had some degree of adrenal dysfunction, right? And so they either had, there's so many different ways to categorize adrenal dysfunction. The simplest way I would say is just the 3 stages of stage 1, when you have too much cortisol. Stage 2 is going to be like the cortisol roller coaster. And stage 3 is when we have not enough cortisol. So I just, for patients' purposes, I've just kind of simplified into these things, although we know there's a whole host of other patterns that we visit. And so the majority of people that I would see would be most likely to have the flatlined adrenals, where they would wake up in the morning barely awake, right? So they'd have to drag themselves out of bed. Then they'd be walking around all day, kind of brain fogged in a spacey kind of fatigue. And maybe they'd get a little bit more energy throughout the day. Like maybe by lunchtime, they'd be able to get themselves together and function a little bit. Then they'd get a little bit anxious after lunch, and then the day would go on, and then they'd just be tired all day, and then nighttime would hit, and all of a sudden they'd get this burst of energy, kind of like a wired but tired feeling, and then wouldn't be able to sleep. And it was like every single day you're in this pattern. And this is kind of a common pattern that I just saw in a lot of people with Hashimoto's. And it just was like, you're on thyroid medications, but you're still you're still experiencing brain fog. You're still experiencing mood issues. You're kind of depressed. You're kind of anxious. Your libido is not really where it's supposed to be. You're struggling with pain in your body. You can't sleep at night. And this was just such a common pattern that I'm like, okay, we need to really address this. For myself, this was a pattern as well. When I first started on my healing journey and I was already on thyroid meds, and I was like, yay, I feel better. And then I was like, wait, why do I feel worse? What is going on? And people were telling me about adrenal fatigue. So I Googled it, and you go to Mayo Clinic or something, and they're like, it's a made up disorder. It doesn't exist. And it was like, it's like quack diagnosis, or just something very, very much saying this is fake and it doesn't exist. So I was like, okay, well, I can't have something that doesn't exist, right? And then finally, somebody that I knew, a pharmacist that I knew, was like, oh, have you looked into adrenal fatigue? And I was, for some reason, maybe coming from him, I believed him, where maybe another person I wouldn't have believed that. I don't know. Maybe you just have to hear it from the right person, or enough times to get it into your head. But sure enough, the adrenal protocols worked really, really well for me. And I felt so much better. I was like, wow, this crazy quack medicine voodoo stuff actually works, right? So sure enough, most of my clients have done the same. Is you get their adrenals supported, and within 4 weeks, they feel really, really amazing. And I did write about the adrenals in every single one of my books that I've written about Hashimoto's and on my website. The reason why I decided to write a whole book about it, and it's to your point of like the joys of having children and how you realize that life before children is so different than life after children, whether that's running a business or taking care of your health. The protocols I used to use for adrenals were very much based on making sure you got lots of sleep, lots of self-care, like sleep 10 to 12 hours a night, don't drink any caffeine, and, take some of these hormones like pregnenolone and DHEA, which can work really, really well. And so those were my previous protocols. Like, I mean, I couldn't really do any of them with like a baby that I was breastfeeding that was waking me up every 2 hours, like for a few years straight. So like, I was like, okay, my adrenals are flatlined. I know this is really, really bad for my health. I'm like a health expert and I can't take my own advice. Like, what am I going to do? And so I had to think of just some alternative pathways to really balance the adrenals that didn't rely on hormones, that didn't rely on, having a perfect lifestyle that none of us have and not having access to, I kind of had a pretty decent lifestyle before I had kids. I could say like, I'm going to sleep 12 hours tonight and nobody was going to tell me no, right? And I could quit coffee and all of these things. But I wanted to come up with, I just kind of discovered these protocols and these alternative pathways to overcome the symptoms of adrenal dysfunction and stress symptoms. And that's why I decided to write a whole nother book. And initially when I got myself better, I piloted it with over 3,000 of my clients, of my readers in a program, the Adrenal Transformation Program that took place over the course of 2 years. So, or I've ran it with 7 different groups over 2 years of 3,000 people.
So we're all geeks on this podcast. We all love to dig into the mechanisms. So can you talk a little bit about some of the biochemical mechanisms by which adrenal dysfunction impacts thyroid health?
So some of the patterns that tend to happen whenever we have adrenal dysfunction is we can essentially have higher levels of reverse T3. And reverse T3 will bind our receptors, our thyroid receptors, but instead of activating them, it will actually just like sit there and prevent actual thyroid hormone from stimulating them. And so people with adrenal issues will oftentimes have these thyroid symptoms, right? And it's like, why is, like you said, this is like a really big cause of people having quote unquote perfect thyroid function, but they still struggle with thyroid symptoms. And so when we think about our hormones, they're in the beautiful symphony, right? And so various hormones talk to each other. It's not like you just have one hormone in a bucket here and one hormone in a bucket there and they don't mix, right?
Right.
So the other kind of pattern that is really relevant is that thyroid hormone actually causes us to clear out cortisol. So whenever people start on thyroid hormone, their cortisol clearance is gonna go up. So maybe their cortisol levels were okay before they started on hormones, or the body basically will compensate. When you're hypothyroid, it'll allow you to keep more cortisol on board. But when you start taking the hormones, it'll start clearing that out. And so what was maybe like a healthy-ish cortisol pattern, once you correct the hypothyroidism, is going to show itself up as an unhealthy cortisol pattern, if that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense. And when we do testing, I teach people to test via the Dutch test. I love that because it's not just, all these patterns of 4 times a day, 5 times a day, you test the cortisol. It's also testing the metabolites. So you can see the cortisol clearance. And sometimes when we look at the cortisol clearance, the metabolites versus the actual active cortisol, the free cortisol, we go, whoa, why is there such a difference? Why is there such a high level of metabolites or low level of metabolites compared to the active and free? And has to do with thyroid. That's one of the things I look at. I mean, liver dysfunction and other things like that. But one of the most common causes is thyroid. And people will say, it looks like from your adrenal test that you're hyperthyroid, that you have too much thyroid hormone. And they go, huh? What do you mean? I have hypothyroidism and I'm on medication. You could be over medicated. And so we send them back to get that reevaluated. So yeah, they're so connected that way. And what you said about the reverse T3, right? You'll see lower levels of free T3 and higher levels of reverse T3 because we need just the right amount of cortisol for that deiodinase enzyme that converts T4 to T3. And so we see that. And then you said about the receptors, right? Because high levels of cortisol and even too low levels of cortisol sometimes affect the uptake of the thyroid into the cell and then the uptake into the nucleus where it's activated. So all of these things make it so important. You can't just treat one hormone without the rest.
And you explain it so well. And I also see low ferritin levels too. They can kind of impact the whole pathway when you don't have even a thyroid issue or your thyroid is balanced, but your ferritin levels are off. That can impact the clearance, right? And so there's just so many things that I say. It's like, we don't just have hormones individually in a bucket. Like they're talking to each other, and you have to turn all the different dials to be just right to really get the body feeling well.
Exactly. Well, this is fascinating. I can't wait for your other book to come out. When your book comes out, let's have you back and we'll talk about all those really cool protocols that you've come up with for the adrenals. And I'm super excited. We've been talking. Any last words to our practitioners as they, handle, the complex cases that are coming in these days? It's not enough to just say, to do what you learned about in pharmacy school, to do what they might have learned about in an allopathic medical school. And here's the drug, here's the symptoms you have, here's what the lab test comes out, here you go. Because it doesn't work that way, right? And we really have to be astute enough to dig in and understand the biochemistry so that we can tweak using diet, lifestyle, supplementation, all those wonderful things, and detox and food elimination and all this that plays in to affecting every system in the body. So last words of wisdom from our dear and wonderful, smart Dr. Izabella Wentz.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I would say I'm really grateful for all the practitioners taking the time to learn how to best care for their patients. So I really, really appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And I mean, whenever you have a person that is just struggling, coming to see you, just think about, and if they haven't had their thyroid antibodies tested, please make sure that you test their thyroid antibodies. If they're having some thyroid symptoms and something seems off, please look at their ferritin levels as well. Sometimes having not enough ferritin on board can actually cause a lot of the symptoms. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you having me.
Thank you so much. And when you look at the show notes page, you'll see a list of our 3 books. What are the 3 books? Remind me the names of the 3 books you have out there so far.
Sure. We have Hashimoto's The Root Cause. Then my first book, I have Hashimoto's Protocol. So this first book is for science nerds with a lot of mechanisms of actions and pathways and potential root causes. This book focuses on protocols. So it has a 90-day plan to reverse thyroid symptoms. And then, of course, I know people always love dietary guidance. So this is a recipe guide, nutrition recipe guide. It goes into detail into things about nutrients and digestive enzymes and has some yummy recipes.
Beautiful. Nice 3 trilogy that you've done so far. So appreciate that. Check out the show notes page and we'll make sure that we can hook you up with Dr. Izabella Wentz. And I just want to reinforce for you guys, you're in the right place if you are looking for functional and root causes of your patients and your clients' illnesses, right? And it doesn't mean that what you learned in pharmacy school or what you learned in medical school gets thrown out the window. There's a time and a place for all of it. But what's missing is this deep dive to help people truly get to the heart of what's going on. So you have the power using nutrition and lifestyle and stress management and supplementation as needed and herbs and things that are, balancing the body. You have that in your power to use that to restore health to people that have been around the block a few times, visited a lot of different doctors and haven't gotten help. So use that power. If you want to go deeper into some of the thyroid stuff, we put together a little book at reinventhealthcare.com/thyroid. It just has some reference materials and medications that get in the way of thyroid function and herbs that help to support. So you can get that as a free download. And keep going. Keep your heart up. And until next time, shine on.